One day, you walk in here. Suddenly, you're transported to heaven. That's what Gothic architecture was designed to be, a glimpse of heaven on earth, a heavenly Jerusalem, a way of building that lifted the soul of man closer to God. Gothic, the great architectural legacy of the Middle Ages, came to Britain in the 12th century. 100 years before, the Normans had conquered this country with castles and cathedrals asserting their power in stone. They built massively and solidly in the style that we call Romanesque, because it imitated the architecture of ancient Rome. But this style had its limitations. The rounded arches could only span relatively small gaps before collapsing under the weight of the walls above. But French masons, learning from Arab architecture, realized they could overcome these problems by building pointed arches. These new Gothic arches could span far greater distances, with slimmer and more elegant pillars supporting them. A new type of ceiling vault could be constructed, higher, lighter and wider, and huge windows could be built, allowing light to stream in. Abbots and bishops immediately wanted to build in this new style and create a new type of cathedral. This is the architecture of the pointed arch, which made it possible to fill these buildings with a sense of space and to allow the light of God to come pouring in. Gothic swept England, Scotland and Wales and became the dominant style of building in Britain for 300 years. The catalyst for this stylistic revolution came in 1174, when a catastrophic fire destroyed the entire eastern arm of Canterbury Cathedral. Only 4 years earlier, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, had been murdered here by royal soldiers. The monks built a shrine for his remains, and very soon tens of thousands of pilgrims flocked to pray at it. The pilgrims brought huge wealth to Canterbury and funded an extraordinarily ambitious rebuilding campaign. The Prior of Canterbury decided to employ the most famous international architect of his day, William of Song. He was the leading exponent of the new Gothic style. The monk Jervis was astonished by the new architecture he produced. For the new pillars were elongated by almost 12 feet. In the old capitals, the work was plain. In the new ones, exquisite in sculpture. For the old roof, there was a ceiling of wood, decorated with excellent painting. But now there is a vault beautifully constructed of stone. But while William of Song was at work in the vaulted roof of his Gothic masterpiece, disaster struck. Suddenly, the beams broke under his feet and he fell to the ground, stones and timbers accompanying his fall, from the height of the capitals of the upper vault, that is to say, of 50 feet. His life was destroyed creating this, the first Gothic building in Britain. And then we come down to the floor of the choir.
Yes, and here we have the highest, or the widest of all the vaults here, this fabulous vault across the eastern crossing, and this is where the scaffolding collapsed under poor old William of Song, where he fell down onto the floor here and was very badly hurt.
It must have been a disaster at the time.
Well, it obviously was, because he was directing the whole project, you know, and what was going to happen if he could no longer do it.
It's sort of the equivalent of Norman Foster falling off the top of the gherkin, isn't it, really?
I suppose you could look at it like that.
I mean, looking a little bit at the cathedral like this, you can see why Jervis must have been so excited. I mean, the difference was so obvious, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, because here, in the early 12th century, you have round arches, simple chip carving, typical Norman Romanesque, and then suddenly you have not only the pointed arch, but this very deeply incised architecture here, something that's completely new.
And then it's translated, of course, into something infinitely more complex, isn't it?
Exactly. What you really have, and when you look up around here in this eastern arm of Canterbury Cathedral, is these wonderful vaults, the high vaults, all around us, both in the aisles and in the upper work here. And they're experimenting over very wide distances here.
And what's so brilliant about this is what we're looking at is the birth of Gothic.
In England, that's exactly right.
William of Sens' work was completed by an English architect according to the plan that he'd left behind. This spectacular new home for Thomas Becket's shrine became the most famous pilgrimage site in England. Like Norman architecture, Gothic originally came from France, and just as English masons had embellished and decorated Norman buildings, so our masons would turn Gothic architecture into a riot of colour and decoration. They were about to create English Gothic. In the 13th and 14th century, England was rich. Much of that wealth was concentrated in the hands of the church, and the greatest expression of this wealth was in building. More than 10,000 Gothic parish churches and cathedrals were constructed. It was a vast industry, employing thousands of masons, glaziers, and metalworkers. Towns and cities throughout the land resounded with the sound of construction. But just like the imported architecture of the Normans, which became anglicised, Gothic too soon acquired its own distinctively English features. The first of the great churches to be built in a local style of Gothic without the influence of France was Wells Cathedral in Somerset. To the pilgrim or the inhabitant of Wells, this would have been a wonderful sight. Life on earth was all about preparing for life after death, and an immense cathedral offered the chance of salvation. This was an insurance policy for the afterlife. Thousands of tons of Somerset limestone and Purbeck marble went into these beautifully sculpted arches and pillars. We see cathedrals as public spaces open to everyone. But in the 12th century, they were prayer machines operated by professionals. A cathedral in the Middle Ages was very different to what it is today. It was divided into two parts. There was the nave, which was the part for the people. It had no chairs in it. And then there was the east end, with the choir at its heart, which was essentially a church within a church. That church within a church, the choir, was the most highly decorated, the most beautiful part of the cathedral. It was the receptacle within which the priests met their God. This was the inner sanctum, where behind highly carved screens prayers were offered day and night. It was a sort of heaven on earth, where carvers and masons had decorated every architectural element. Everywhere were pinnacles, statues, and bunches of carved leaves. The space was filled with light from giant stained glass windows. But while all this was reserved for the priests, outside, on the west front, there was something equally amazing for ordinary people. As you approach Wells, on the west front is one of the wonders of the medieval age. a vast picture in carved stone of the history of the world. Here are more than 300 figures, some 8 feet high, stacked up in tiers, and at the top, 200 feet up, is Christ himself. In the 14th century, this would have been even more amazing, because it was originally whitewashed and then brilliantly painted, red, green, yellow and blue. No one can be in any doubt as to why this type of Gothic is simply called decorated. This facade here, you can't envisage this happening on the continent, can you?
No, it's quite English, sort of wallpaper of statuary.
And that is what the English wanted to achieve, wasn't
Yes.
it? They didn't want to leave a single inch of this whole facade really unadorned, but everything is decorated. isn't
Everything
it?
was decorated, yes.
I think it was Pope Gregory who said that architecture was a book for the people. And this really has to be a book for the people, hasn't it? Because it tells the story.
It tells the story, yes. We have everything here. We have the Old Testament figures, we have New Testament figures, we have people of all estates of life, kings, bishops, popes, prophets, the whole of history is represented there. And we rise up through temporal history to, of course, death and beyond. And so the very top frieze that runs right the way round the front has all these small niches with these people coming out of coffins or coming out of the ground. They are shown naked and they are lifting coffin lids up or popping out of them in various ways, and this is the general resurrection.
This is more than a book in stone for the people. It was, in fact, a piece of theatre.
Up in the central gable, above the resurrection, you have the 9 angels, and just above those angels, you can see holes like gun ports. Well, those are trumpet holes, and so the trumpeters, 8 of them between the 9 angels, stood on a platform up in the roof. This is above the high vault, we're right up in the roof, and they could trumpet, so the last trump is there literally. If you look at the quatrefoils just above the doors, they have got in the back of them little holes, and those holes go through to a gallery inside.
That's right.
And so you can have boys singing in the gallery, and therefore the figures on the west front are literally singing out to the gathered people out here.
The West Front was an extraordinary stage set, a backdrop for the public ceremonies of the cathedral. In a world where few people could read, here was all you needed to know about your place in society and how to get to heaven. The decorated style relied entirely on the brilliance of the cathedral's masons and carvers. Most of them are anonymous, but looking round we can get an insight into their skill and imagination. And it's been suggested that this small head may be a portrait of the cathedral's master mason, Adam Locke, the genius who masterminded the construction of the West Front, but died before it could be completed. The wonderful carving inside Wells is not just Christian in theme. It deliberately reflected everyday, ordinary life, the sort of life that would have been instantly recognisable to pilgrims. This man steals his neighbour's grapes and gets bashed on the head in return. This one's rotten teeth gave him terrible toothache. But the decorated style was not just about surface detail. for the early Middle Ages produced some of the most brilliant engineering feats in our history. At Wells, engineering and architecture combined to produce one of the most startling architectural forms anywhere, the scissor arches. They were built in the early 14th century, when it was realized that the Great Crossing Tower was unstable. So the masons resolved a serious problem by some architectural gymnastics, bracing the great supports of the central tower with two Gothic arches, the upper one upside down. All over 14th century Britain, masons were pushing engineering to its limits. At Salisbury, in Wiltshire, the most daring architectural adventure of the entire Middle Ages was underway. Engineer Ed McCann is going to investigate the ingenuity behind the building of a medieval skyscraper.
I'm 200 feet above the ground. In medieval times, virtually no one would ever have got that high up. And what's more, I'm only halfway to the top. At 400 feet high, it's the tallest medieval building in the world, but it could have ended in disaster. The skyscrapers of New York were built on solid rock, but here, 600 years earlier, medieval masons built this spectacular skyscraper on a water meadow, on foundations only 4 foot deep. And while some cathedrals, like Wells, were built over hundreds of years, this one was built in just 38, and it used 60,000 tons of stone. It took hundreds of people working around the clock. As a modern engineer, I rely on computers and machinery to do just about anything, and I'm astonished that medieval masons could achieve this. Amazingly, there's still some medieval engineering kit in here that shows us how it was done. There are 5,000 tons of stone in this spire. That's a lot of stone to lift up 200 feet from the ground. And this is what they used to do it. Giant medieval hamster wheel, which was a sort of treadmill or windlass. And this is the winch that they used to lift all of the stone up. And the way it works is you would put the rope down to the ground onto a tray, and you put your stone onto the tray, and the rope is wound round this, and as I turn the wheel round, the rope winds up and the stone gets lifted up here. And the way you made this thing go around was, we think 4 people used it, and they would climb up on the outside here, and they would get their arms and their legs working and putting as much oomph into it as they could. Medieval masons weren't hampered by all the health and safety concerns of today. Most of them knew they might die building this cathedral, and many of them did. So I get the ram hooked on, him on. Going up this ancient timber scaffolding, I can imagine that this was like climbing to heaven. This spire is 25 times higher than a medieval house. And so here I am, right up the top, and that little innocuous looking door there is the way out onto the roof, so I'm going to go up there. So right up the top, 400 feet, up the top of Salisbury Cathedral, and all that stands between me and the outside world is a 1-inch padlock, top of 5,000 tons of stone. I'll tuck those in my pocket. Let's see what's outside. Wow, that is amazing. Fantastic. Whoop, all the way down to the bottom there. That's a long way down. And when the masons had finished hauling stone up here, there would have been one last glorious task, putting the cross on top. And that's one job I wouldn't fancy doing at all. It's stunning to look at, but the trouble with Salisbury Spire was that the foundations simply weren't deep enough. Not long after the spire was built, the extra weight pushed down on the tower underneath. And today, you can still see where the damage occurred. When they put the new spire on, they built it out of stone. What happened?
The building had a terrible shock. This is a building which was intended to finish at roof level, and the addition of not just the spire, but the tower as well, subjected this building to a terrific extra weight. And the result, as we can see in the building, is that it has buckled, it's bent. We've got all sorts of strange angles on the building. If we look at these black polished Purbeck marble shafts, if we follow them up, you see when you get to about there, they're twisting away in that direction. They've taken quite an amount of the settlement, it seems, but they are making this extraordinarily curved shape. They're under a lot of pressure.
Not only are the columns struggling, but the arches also show the signs of subsidence under the tower.
If we go back and look at the point where it starts, we can see there a problem in the building. It's twisting away at that point there, but it hasn't failed.
So up at this end here, it's 6 inches lower than it is over there.
Yes.
And is there any record from that time? Do people talk about, is there in medieval press saying, don't go to Salisbury, come to Winchester, Salisbury's falling down?
What you tend to find is appeals to the king. Please, can we avoid paying taxes for a while? Appeals to the Pope.
Got to fix my church.
We need money. We need people to donate to the Restoration Fund. I think Salisbury's had a longer Restoration Fund than anywhere else.
Building high to reach closer to God obviously had its problems. It may seem obvious now that adding 20 stories onto the top of an existing building on 4-foot foundations in a water meadow is likely to cause problems. But these were the pioneering days of tall buildings in Britain. And the masons were incredibly inventive. They came up with this great solution to the problem, a strainer arch. What this does is it stops these columns, one on either side of me, being pushed towards me. You see, what happens is at the end of a row of arches, as we have going down the choir and the nave here, you get a little push at the end. The arches are unbalanced and they want to push out like this. The strainer arch effectively pushes back and stops the columns coming together and buckling. The masons may have overreached themselves, but their ambition and their bravery paid off. If they hadn't dared to build this spire on wafer-thin foundations in the middle of a bog, Salisbury wouldn't have this incredible monument to engineering and invention.
The masons of medieval Britain were brilliant engineers producing soaring structures that rivaled any in Europe. They carved and embellished them with fertile imagination and great skill. But a disaster of biblical proportions was about to devastate medieval Britain and even change the course of British architecture. The extraordinary creativity of the medieval church is all around us today. There are about 16,000 medieval churches. By about 1350, most of these were being built in the richly carved and highly creative Gothic style that we call decorated. And in the midst of this great surge of creativity came a calamity that was to change the face of medieval Britain. The Black Death arrived in London from the east in the autumn of 1348. It wiped out half of the population of Britain. Stephen Parisian is in London on a quest to uncover the clues that reveal how medieval life became hell on earth.
I'm here in the heart of the City of London to see what the Black Death left in its wake and to discover the effect this absolutely devastating disease had on the lives and the minds of London's medieval citizens.
I also want to know how this besieged city coped with this crisis. In only 18 months, more than 40,000 Londoners died a swift and horrible death. Aside from the psychological panic gripping the population, was the practical problem of how and where to house all the dead. And this was the solution.
Under my feet here in Charterhouse Square, today a lovely city oasis, lie the bones of tens of thousands of London's plague victims.
This was the biggest of London's emergency cemeteries, created to cope with the crisis.
At the height of the disaster, 200 bodies a day were being buried here in mass graves. 200 bodies a day. The foul smell of the plague dead must have been unbearable.
But even the emergency cemeteries couldn't cope with all the corpses. Existing graves had to be emptied to make room for the newly dead. But what to do with all the skeletons and bones of the bodies that had been exhumed? Here, under the pavements of a gleaming new office complex in the City of London, lies the solution. This is the architecture of death. A charnel house, a building used to store bones that had been removed from graveyards. At the height of the Black Death, it became home to thousands of skeletons.
You can see this is probably just a fraction of the skulls and the long bones that would have been stacked up in this building.
The charnel house took care of the bones, but there would have also been a chapel above.
And the chapel would have had priests, and the priests would have been celebrating masses for the souls of the lost and the bones that were stored in the basement underneath.
So it's just as important to be near the church after death as in life?
Absolutely. It was vitally important that your physical remains remained in consecrated ground, because otherwise the medieval people really believed that fiends and demons could animate their bones and come back to bring them back to life, to cause mayhem and destruction among the living. So it's vitally important.
The population was seized with panic. Worse than the prospect of painful death was the possibility of perpetual torment in hell. If death rites weren't carried out correctly, your soul would perish. So wills were written with great urgency. Incredibly, some of these still survive today, giving us an insight into the minds of these terrified individuals. So what sort of stories are they telling us in general?
The first example is Gerard the Armourer, who gives money in his will to the chapel at the emergency cemetery at Charterhouse, showing that he's putting money into the very chapel that's going to look after the souls of the plague dead.
We've got this marvellous one here, haven't we, from Matilda at Vine.
Yes.
What does this say?
Well, this is a remarkable will, because Matilda is a wealthy Londoner. She's assessed just the year before the plague hits at over £10 worth of goods and chattels, which is a substantial sum. She's a widow, but she is so concerned at the rate of death of the clergy in London, the people who are she's going to confess her sins to, that she actually appeals to the Pope personally in a letter saying, can I have permission to choose my own confessor to make sure that my sins are cleansed at the hour of my death? And the letter comes back saying, yes, you can. It comes back 3 days after she dies.
She must have died in terror then, because if you died unconfessed in the medieval period, then you had no idea whether your soul was going to go to heaven or hell or purgatory.
Absolutely. It would have been an exquisite medieval mental torture, spiritual torture, not to know that your sins had been cleansed by a priest or by somebody appointed. And so, yes, she would have died in terror.
I've now come to realise that in medieval Britain, the church and the clergy were as important in death as they were in life.
The Black Death caused seismic waves that reach every corner of medieval culture and society. It's impossible for us today to understand the deep psychological scars that the death of half the population left on Britain. The sense of national trauma was like Britain after the First World War. No one had built churches during the Black Death, but when they started again, they couldn't imagine building in the exuberant, decorated style of before. This is Patrington Church in Yorkshire. in my view, one of the most perfect parish churches in the country. It was built in the short period of 50 years immediately before the Black Death. Here you see the decorated Gothic style at its richest. This church even has a decorated stone vaulted ceiling. This is a huge celebration of the wealth and creativity of the early 14th century. But the really extraordinary thing about this church is just over here. Here, the vaulting hasn't been completed. The masons were stopped dead in their tracks by something, and that something was almost certainly the Black Death. The stone vault was never completed and was eventually finished in timber. Despite the death of many masons during the plague, when it had passed, the richest churches were able to restart construction. So the people of Patchington started to build again, and they constructed this beautiful spire on top of their parish church. But the style of it wasn't decorated. It was something much plainer, much more simple, and much less ornate. People argue about why there was a change in style, but I think there is a perfectly good explanation. England had been traumatised by the Black Death, and afterwards they didn't want churches that had the exuberance of the decorated style. They were looking for something more sober, more straightforward, reflecting a nation that was grieving. This new plainer style is known as the Perpendicular because of its unadorned vertical lines. It was this style of Gothic that was to dominate building in Britain for 150 years and was subsequently to be imitated by the Victorians in towns and cities across the country. Gothic was not just the architecture of the church, although it's where most of us encounter it today. It was the style in which everyone built. Anna Kay has gone to find out how Gothic was used in secular buildings.
Oxford, probably the most beautiful city in the whole of the British Isles. Something about it which captures our imagination now, and its Gothic skyline has become famous in the words of Matthew Arnold for its dreaming spires. But how did it come to have such a concentration of great Gothic buildings?
As the country recovered from the Black Death, there was a desperate shortage of priests. Priests not only looked after the nation's souls, but as educated men, they filled many posts in government. So, in 1379, William of Wykeham, the wealthy Bishop of Winchester, took a radical decision. He decided to found a college at Oxford in order to produce a new generation of men trained for the priesthood. William of Wykeham's visionary design for New College would become the blueprint for university architecture for centuries to come. His brainwave was to construct a quadrangle, incorporating all the buildings that students would need: the hall, the chapel, the library, and the lodgings. This neat, self-contained arrangement of rooms would encourage the students to lead dignified and orderly lives. William of Wykeham not only planned the buildings, he set out in meticulous detail how life should be lived in his college. A copy of this rulebook still exists today.
Well, this is one of the copies of the college statutes. Dates from about 1396, and it's open at the page which shows the founder's wishes for how the scholars and fellows should live within college. The amount of detail that these statutes go into is quite phenomenal. He was controlling every aspect of college life.
And of course, in the 14th century, this is an all-male institution, isn't it?
That's right, yes. Statute 59 out of the 68, which is just here, states quite clearly that so far as possible, all servants of the college should be male, and that no female should be allowed inside the precinct.
William of Wykeham, however, was a realist. He made an exception. He realised that it would be very unlikely to find a man willing to do the college laundry. So he said that a female laundress could be employed, but she had to be of such age and such appearance as to excite no interest and cause no ill repute. It's all part of the same thing, the architecture, the way of life, the way the day was planned. Everything feeds into this one whole, trying to create a particular type of scholar from this college.
By the time New College was established, Oxford was home to 2,000 students and was a flourishing centre of academic excellence. But there were still no buildings that had been specifically designed for teaching. All this changed in 1420, when work began on a tour de force of Gothic architecture. This was to be Oxford University's first lecture theatre.
For me, this amazing building, the Divinity School, is somehow the most wonderful and powerful Gothic building in the whole country. And in a way, it's because it isn't a cathedral. It doesn't associate it with worship or religion or things which perhaps feel a bit remote today. It's a giant classroom, and looking at it, you feel a kind of special inspiration, which is quite of its own.
This is Perpendicular Gothic, the style that had become popular since the Black Death. Elegant, simple and inspiring, slender walls, soaring columns and wonderful fan vaulting. This was a lecture room for theology, so debates about religion took place in here. But it wasn't a house of prayer. This is Gothic architecture for thinking in. The carvings on the ceiling celebrate the patrons and sponsors of this extravagant creation, among them the Bishop of London, and even the King himself, Edward IV. It's here that Gothic found its most perfect expression as the architectural language of learning. Around the Divinity School developed the buildings that now form one of the most important repositories of knowledge in the world, the Bodleian Library. Oxford's a town of the Middle Ages, if ever there was one. But if you look a little more closely, you realise that the architecture of Oxford plays tricks on you. This looks like a medieval courtyard, but on the tower you can see a statue of James I and his coat of arms, telling us that this is in fact 17th century. While Gothic fell from fashion in Britain in the mid-16th century, with new classical styles emerging to take its place, in Oxford this never really happened. Christ Church College was built in the early 16th century, right at the end of the Gothic age. But wonderful Gothic creations were constantly being added here throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, like this glorious fan-vaulted ceiling. And perhaps most tellingly of all, this tower. It has hints of classical, but it's overwhelmingly Gothic. It was designed by Christopher Wren. The Gothic style had gathered such momentum in Oxford that not even Christopher Wren, the master of Baroque architecture, could resist it. This wonderful tower is his contribution to its survival in Oxford. Despite ever-changing fashions in architecture, here in Oxford, Gothic became the architectural language of learning, and its exquisite buildings still inspire us today.
The story of Oxford tells us that Gothic architecture never really died out in Britain. In fact, by the reign of Queen Victoria, it had become once again the national style. And the national style of Britain was soon to become the style of the British Empire. In October 1834, the Houses of Parliament were destroyed in a disastrous fire. The government quickly decided that it should be rebuilt in a Gothic style and launched a competition to find an architect who was capable of doing it. It was won by Charles Barry, who proposed a new building in the Perpendicular Gothic style. But why did the Victorians wish to present Britain to the world in the style of the Middle Ages? From the late 18th century, Gothic was admired again for its romantic possibilities, for its power to evoke what was seen as the glories of the Middle Ages. The men who commissioned the new Houses of Parliament saw the Middle Ages as our golden age, a period of social stability, hierarchy, wealth, godliness, and architectural purity. Today, each day, our MPs enter Parliament through a building closely modelled on the glorious Perpendicular Royal Chapel of St Stephen. Its walls are lined with the statues of great men of the realm. This is the prelude to the central lobby, which, like the west front of Wells Cathedral, is a history lesson in stone. Here are statues of all the monarchs, reinforcing the basis of power in the early Victorian age. This extraordinary lesson in British history continues on the outside of the building and can be seen from the River Thames. Our entire national story is here, from William the Conqueror to Queen Victoria.
This building is, for me, perhaps more than any other building, a symbol of our national history. It was built as such. It was covered in carvings that were representing the kings and queens of England, their coats of arms, and their great achievements. And that's what the Victorians were trying to convey with the Houses of Parliament. They were trying to convey the greatness of the nation, the strength of the monarchy, the power of the state. And this building does it like no other.
The Houses of Parliament set the seal on Gothic as the official national style of architecture. And that's why, from railways to schools to town halls to museums and libraries, Gothic architecture is the language of Britain's Victorian towns and cities. By the late 19th century, native forms of Gothic, such as the Perpendicular of the Houses of Parliament, had blended with other types of Gothic architecture from France and elsewhere. This is the last great Victorian Gothic monument in London, the Royal Courts of Justice, built in the 1870s in a blend of Gothic styles to provide a home for the High Court of England. It was designed by the architect G.E. Street, one of the most talented Victorians working in Gothic. The central hall, 230 feet long and 82 feet high, is of cathedral-like proportions.
I hold the oldest judicial office in the land. I'm the Queen's Remembrancer, which dates from 1164, and now am the oldest judge of that office. And it does something for you to come into this building and say, wow, this is where I work.
I find it very interesting that your illustrious predecessors and the society they lived in wanted to build this incredibly important building, which you described as sort of encapsulating this legal system, which is unique to us, yes. Wanted to do it in a Gothic style, a style that had been first practiced 600 years before.
This is the style of respectability. Coming into this hall, everybody is reduced to a common denominator. You cannot make a grand entry into this hall. Be you a minister, a film star, a very important businessman, when you come through those doors over there, you are just a human being.
But isn't that just like a Gothic cathedral? When you walked into a cathedral, you were all the same below God.
Exactly.
And so the effect that the architect of this building, G.E. Street, was trying to achieve was exactly the effect that the medieval architects were trying to achieve in cathedrals.
He designed it for a very special purpose. 18 judges delivering the law, and it works supremely well.
19th century culture and society were changing at an incredible and destabilising speed. And so the Victorians back to medieval society, one they saw as stable and moral. The people of medieval Britain created an inspiration for the future. They made Gothic architecture into a distinctive national style that was taken up by the Victorians. Today, our laws are made in Gothic buildings, and so for many, including me, Gothic is still our national style. The legacy of the Victorians who revived Gothic and the medieval masons who invented it is with us still. No matter where you are in Britain today, you're never more than a short walk from a Gothic building. Next time, I'm going to be looking at the buildings that dominated medieval Britain and shaped the Britain we know today, the monasteries and the castles.